Many of us fondly remember Sega's arcade sprite scaling games from the 1980s. They were standout titles that looked significantly more advanced than most of the other stuff that sat beside it. But Sega was also heavily invested in making traditional two-dimensional titles. Released in 1982, its System 1 arcade board gave birth to classics like Flicky, Choplifter, My Hero, Ninja Princess, and Wonder Boy. Sega then released a mildly upgraded version of that called the Sega System 2 in 1985. Both these platforms sported an 8-bit Z80 CPU, and Sega was looking to upgrade that technology in a pretty big way. At the very end of 1985, they decided it was time to move up to the Motorola 68000, and a vastly superior collection of sound chips, and of course a big uptick in graphical capabilities. This new board did not have an official name quite yet, but it would eventually become the Sega System 16. This technology would be the core of Sega's two-dimensional arcade releases for many years to follow, a lifespan that lasted 5 years and inspired the design of several other Sega-made arcade boards. During its run, it would see a couple of revisions itself, noted as the A, B, and C versions, which upgraded the speed, sound, and memory to give it a bit more kick. Besides that powerful 10 MHz 68000, the System 16 boasted over 4,000 on-screen colors, sprite scaling capabilities, and a set of sound chips that could really belt out some fantastic tunes. With over 40 releases to its name, I thought it'd be cool to take a look at exactly what this board was capable of and the many classic Sega series that began life there. I hope you guys enjoy Arcade Power and the best of the Sega System 16. In 1987, the System 16 received the run-and-gun hit Alien Syndrome. This was clearly based on the popular film franchise with aliens infesting your ship and you having to rescue the crew. You get lots of weapon choices, massive bosses, and you can do it all with a friend. It's a release I wish the Genesis had gotten at launch, though the Master System did see a stripped-down port that same year. Quartet and Quartet 2 were released in 1987 as well. Quartet is a 4-player running gun that featured a cabinet supporting 4 joysticks and the action buttons to accompany them. Quartet 2 was actually the same game that was sold as a conversion kit for other titles that only supported 2-player co-op. It's actually a pretty neat game, kinda like Contra, but with jetpacks and keys to open doors to the next stage. It's tough and definitely built for more than one player. I like it though. The gameplay feels different enough from the other games in the genre to earn it some respect. In 1986, Sega released its take on Spy Hunter called Action Fighter. This was a vertically scrolling car combat game where you switched vehicles as you eradicated the enemy threat. You had a souped-up sports car, a powerful racing bike, a combat helicopter, and even a jet ski. You can pick up additional weapons too, stuff like missiles and more powerful guns. It's fast, challenging, and looked great for a game of its time. I thought this was significantly better than Spy Hunter, and Sega ported it home to the Master System that same year. Unfortunately, this arcade version saw its main distribution in Japan, so there are likely many of you that have not played it before. If you enjoy car combat or shooters in general, I highly recommend it. Good old Fantasy Zone got its start right here on the System 16 in 1986. This stars the little ship Opa Opa in a horizontal shoot 'em up that allows you to go forward and backward as you hunt down enemy bases and destroy massive screen-filling bosses. You can buy weapons with the coins you collect for some added variety, though you only get them for a limited time. The visuals are bright, colorful, and the alien worlds look fantastic. Multiple sequels would follow, but I always thought it was best right here. "1987 brought out the big dogs with Shinobi, the side-scrolling ninja action title that spawned a number of fantastic sequels itself. The original here was built around the mechanics of Rolling Thunder, where you would face enemies on multiple levels. Our hero Joe Musashi has access to different weaponry and ninja magic, as he battles increasingly difficult enemies across 5 different areas that include multiple sub-stages. Your goal is to rescue children from the evil Zed and take down their criminal organization for good. There was also a brilliant bonus stage where you must target ninja as they attempted to advance on your position. Home ports at the time were fun, but none of them came close to the arcade feel. It really makes you wish Sega had ported this to the Genesis before Revenge of Shinobi. There is a fan translation in the works that hopefully gets finished. There are so many Wonder Boy games, it's easy to get them mixed up. When Wonder Boy 3 Monster Lair showed up in 1988, it began all kinds of confusion because there would be another Wonder Boy 3 called The Dragon's Trap less than a year later. This one was a run-and-gun platformer shoot-'em-up hybrid that had colorful visuals and loads of power-ups. I didn't get to play it until sometime later when I found it on the TurboGrafx CD. I really enjoyed this though and thought it was a nice change of pace from the previous titles in the series. The Mega Drive saw a port in Japan and Europe that was pretty good too. "1988 was when the classic beat-em-up Altered Beast showed up on the System 16. I still remember seeing this in the arcade for the first time and being blown away. It looked so cool and the cinematic transformations were really impressive. It even had some cool little sprite scaling effects on the bad guys when they exploded. Best part was playing 2-player co-op though, allowing you and a friend to run roughshod over the enemy. The sound presentation was impressive as well. The voice work, the howl of the animals, you almost always heard an Altered Beast cab before you actually saw it. It may be antiquated by today's standards, but back then, this was a great time, and I always appreciated it as the Genesis pack-in. There are not many Sega games I have hated from the moment I first played them, but 1988's Dynamite Ducks is definitely in that group. I legitimately didn't play this game until many years after its release, but boy was it an immediate turn-off. You are a duck named Ben trying to rescue a girl from an evil wizard. It's a beat-em-up with access to weapons, so you'd think I'd love it, yet everything about this is off-putting to me. The art, the music, the way it plays, I just can't get into it. Funnily enough, it's a Sega AM2 release, and I usually love their titles. There are folks out there that really like this, and there are numerous ports of it, including a Master System edition. It's not my thing, but you should definitely try it. It's pretty unique among the Sega-made arcade titles. E-swat came out in 1989 and was sort of Sega's take on the RoboCop idea. Here you start out as a regular cop taking down bad guys before getting your very own cyber exoskeleton. Your job is to clean up the streets of Liberty City and destroy the Evil Eye organization that runs it all from behind the scenes. It's basically a walk-in gun where hundreds of enemies are thrown at you in a near constant barrage that can be rather tough. I really enjoyed it though, especially the visuals, which has lots of large detailed sprites and some fairly decent animation. There's 15 stages, but they go by pretty fast, and there's 2-player co-op. When Sega brought this home to the Genesis, they used the same premise, but completely remade it into a new game. When Golden Axe hit the arcade in 1989, it was a revelation. Hack and slash beat 'em ups were nothing new, of course, but this one had a style and play that felt like nothing else. The enemies were huge and magic filled the screen with some incredible effects. The memorable cast of heroes were perfectly balanced, and the 2-player co-op was simply some of the best of its time. When you saw a Golden Axe cab back in the day, you simply had to drop a credit in and at least play it a little. It was also one of the few arcade titles that you could defeat fairly easily, and usually with only a few continues. Golden Axe proved a lucrative success for Sega and begat numerous home console and arcade sequels that would follow in the years after. I'll never forget playing this for the first time and recognizing the sound effects from the First Blood movie. When Sega brought it home to the Genesis, it was one of the closest arcade ports I'd ever seen, and it even had an extra stage and final boss to boot. Great Sega sports games didn't start on the Genesis, and 1989's MVP sure was one baseball game worth looking into. Aside from the strange art style on the players, I really enjoyed this game. The scaling on the ball when it got hit, the small Neo Geo-like cinematics on the more exciting plays, and the fully voiced play calling were all really impressive for the time. Whenever you crushed a home run, it was really cool to see the Genesis billboards out there in the crowd. It was a maturation of Sega's numerous baseball arcade titles before it, which would eventually inspire its home games like Reggie Jackson and Tommy Lasorda Baseball. It's a bit slow by today's standards, but I still have some really fond memories of it.
Between left and center. It's over his head for a homer.
Tough Turf was a 1989 Double Dragon clone where you played some dude in a tie kicking everyone's ass. There is a heavy emphasis on weapons here, and you pretty much always have access to something to help fight the bad guys. Outside of that, it has your usual punch, kick, and jump attacks these games were well known for. It does have 2-player co-op, but it really didn't do anything special in terms of gameplay. The one area that did stand out was the music, which has an 80s electric feel that should appeal to a great many of you. Sega developed this one jointly with Sunsoft, though neither one would ever port it home to any of Sega's consoles. If you don't have any nostalgia for it, it's pretty difficult to go back and play nowadays, but there's definitely worse beat-em-ups out there. '90s Aurail is the hidden gem of the Sega System 16 library. This little mech-based run-and gun plays fantastic, and even incorporates first-person shooting stages at a time when you didn't see much of that sort of thing. Gameplay has you capable of shooting slowly while moving, or cutting loose rapid-fire volleys as you stay stationary. Your little bipedal tank doesn't just scroll vertically, as the playfield is a bit larger than the screen horizontally, making things a bit challenging as far as enemy placement. Unfortunately, this one was released outside of Japan in very limited numbers, so I didn't know of or play it until many years later. Funny enough, Sega did this jointly with Westone, the developer that did the Wonder Boy titles. This was a completely different experience, and something I would have loved to have seen on the Genesis in its early days. In 1991, Success developed Cotton, a horizontal shooter starring a witch named Cotton and her sidekick fairy named Silk. It's a lighthearted affair that sees Cotton defeating enemies on her quest for candy. Gameplay revolves around leveling up your attacks and crystals you can collect for various special magic spells. It's a beautiful game that holds up well, eventually seeing numerous sequels across many different platforms. Also of note is the memorable soundtrack that really added to the fun and atmosphere of this weird world and its quirky characters. Good stuff if you enjoy the genre. You know how the late 80s and early 90s were loaded with beat-em-ups that weren't particularly special, but weren't exactly awful either? That sums up 1991's Riot City in a nutshell. It was another one developed by Westone that really puts you in the mind of a few of the early Neo Geo beat-em-ups like Robo Army and Mutation Nation. It also takes a number of cues from games like Final Fight, complete with an opening and closing cinematic, mini-map for each area, and special attacks that interrupt enemy combos. It's one you likely didn't see in the wild because not only was it mainly a Japanese release, but it was rare even there. It's worth a playthrough though, if for nothing else than to see the stuff Sega released around the same time as Streets of Rage. I also imagine that's why this game never got a home Genesis conversion. Sega pretty much had that genre down pat at that point. Our final game is something that wasn't released until 2008. Fantasy Zone 2 DX The Tears of Opa Opa was a remake of the original arcade System E version, hardware that was based on the Master System. As you can see, this one looks a whole lot better than a Master System game, coming in on the upgraded System 16 C spec. This one has a pretty interesting story behind it. Apparently fans really weren't happy with the original Fantasy Zone 2 because the Master System level visuals were a huge downgrade from the first, which was done on the System 16. This prompted famed developer M2 to remake the game using an upgraded System 16B spec, which was essentially the 16B with more RAM. The results speak for themselves. This is a much prettier game that even has a few gameplay tweaks. You can now take an extra hit when you have a weapon, and the new charge gauge allows you to hold on to your store purchases. Don't dilly-dally though, there is also a new Reaper enemy that will chase you down if you play it too long, making things noticeably more difficult. If you want to play this one today, look for it on MAME, the PlayStation 2, and the Nintendo 3DS. I think it's pretty clear that Sega System 16 had a pretty profound impact on the development of the Mega Drive and its early games. With Sega and every other arcade maker using the 68000 CPU so heavily, it made sense to develop a home console around that technology. When the Genesis hit in 1989, the vast majority of its software was designed to look like the stuff you were seeing in the arcade, and Sega made no attempts to hide it. They even went after their competitors' games like Forgotten Worlds, Ghouls and Ghosts, and Strider that had been developed on hardware that used the 68000. Its influences aside, I think the System 16 line was a fascinating look at Sega in the late 1980s. So many classic arcade games were born at this time, many of which came to define the company for years to come. The System 16 also gave way to additional arcade technology based on the 68000, the System 18 and the System 24, which had a slew of titles very much in a similar mold. It was here that games like Shadow Dancer, Moonwalker, Alien Storm, and Gain Ground were born, titles that would all be ported or reworked for the home market shortly thereafter. It was during this time that my fandom began to mature for Sega. I had been mesmerized for years by their awesome looking sprite scalers, but I was settling down a bit and starting to really respect them for their game design. Sega knew how to make a game really fun, and their lineup was so different from the stuff Nintendo was making. This led straight into the 16-bit Genesis era, a time when all the arcade influences gelled into a library that just kept on giving. To say it was special does it no justice at all. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.